It was just past midnight when Eleanor stepped out into the storm. The thunder rattled the windows behind her, and rain pounded the pavement in sheets so thick it felt as though the sky itself had collapsed. Clutching her small suitcase, she hesitated on the doorstep of the only home she'd ever known. 40 years of memory's laughter. Tears. All of it lay on the other side of that door, now bolted shut by the son she had raised with her own two hands. "Mum," came Ethan's voice through the wood, muffled but firm. "It's better this way. Better." The word echoed in her mind as the door slammed. The sudden finality of that thud jolted her into motion. She stepped onto the slick sidewalk water seeping under her shoes, mixing bile and mud into a grey smear at her feet. Above her, the streetlight flickered, casting uneasy shadows on the empty houses. Family windows glowed warm behind lace curtains promising dinners and laughter, none of which would ever include Eleanor again. As she wandered away from the house that had sheltered 3 generations, Eleanor's thoughts turned to the broader silence that so often greets an elderly person in crisis. In America today, nearly 1 in 10 seniors lives alone, over 12 million people nationwide, yet fewer than half have close daily contact with family or friends. Each year, tens of thousands of older Americans become victims of emotional or physical abuse, often at the hands of their loved ones. Too many assume that locking a frail parent out in the rain is an isolated tragedy. But in truth, it highlights a deeper fracture in our society, the failure to protect and honor those who once protected us. Take the story of Edith Ramirez, for instance. At 82, Edith was still spry enough to outpace many of her neighbors, but not fast enough to outrun her own daughter's bitterness. When her daughter's divorce left her struggling financially, Edith offered to downsize and move in, intending to help. Instead, she found herself without a bedroom, forced onto a pull-out sofa in the living room. Within weeks, Edith's clothes went missing. Her prescriptions were neglected, and eventually her daughter changed the locks, unable or unwilling to deal with the burden of caring for an aging parent. Edith spent a week sleeping at a bus station before a local shelter took her in. Her story made headlines in California briefly, then faded, as most headlines do, until another tragedy pushed it to the sidelines. What happened to Edith could happen to any of us. Across the country, adult children juggle careers, mortgages, and families of their own. They worry about elder care costs, long-term medical bills, the complexity of insurance and Medicaid. They fear becoming bankrupt if they take on the responsibility of a parent's care. And when frustration mounts, many make a mistake that's more common than they'd like to admit. They cut off the very person who gave them life. It's a mistake, rooted in communication, or rather the lack of it. We rarely talk with our aging parents about what they need, how much help they want, or how much they can afford. We tack on. I'll hire someone to our busy schedules without discussing budgets or long-term plans. We assume they understand why we're overwhelmed without sitting down and saying, "I'm scared, I don't know what to do," or simply, "I love you." Yet research shows that families who have open conversations about aging finances and care options are far more likely to navigate the transition smoothly. A 2023 AARP study found that 68% of families who created a written care plan detailing medical wishes, financial resources, and preferred living arrangements reported higher satisfaction and lower stress levels than those who did not. When conversations happen early, everyone knows what to expect. The elderly feel respected and heard. The caregivers feel supported and informed. Back on that rain-slick sidewalk, Eleanor belatedly understood how different things might have been. If Ethan had sat her down weeks ago and said, "Mom, let's talk about our options," the scene wouldn't have played out in the middle of a thunderstorm. But such conversations are rare until crisis forces them to happen. And by then, the wounds run deep. After leaving her childhood home, Eleanor wandered for blocks, not caring where she went. She didn't knock on doors. No one would answer. She didn't call friends. She didn't even have their numbers. In her purse, a few dollars and 3 faded photographs, one of her and Ethan happily splashing in a pool when he was 5, one of her holding his high school diploma when he was 18, and one of a man named Robert Montgomery smiling beside her at a charity gala. Those photos once brought her comfort. Now they felt like relics of a different life. When dawn finally broke pale and hesitant, Eleanor found herself huddled on a park bench under a lamppost, rain puddling around her feet. A stray cat darted past, wet fur matted, and stared at her with the same fear in its eyes that she saw in her own reflection. Abandoned, alone, invisible. It was in that moment, shivering and defeated, that Eleanor's mind drifted back to Dorothy, her sister, her confidant, now living in Arizona. They'd vowed as children never to let distance or time break their bond. But time had stolen that promise away. Dorothy's address, lost phone number, misplaced. How cruel it felt to be so close to family, and yet so achingly far. Eleanor closed her eyes, willing to surrender to the cold. But beneath the sweatshirt and cardigan, something flickered. A stubborn ember she thought had died long ago. It whispered, "You are not finished." She reached into her suitcase, brushing aside old sweaters, and her fingers found something cool and wooden. A small, lockable chest, the one she'd inherited from her mother, hidden among the unremarkable belongings she'd packed in panic. It felt heavier than she remembered its surface, marred by countless tiny cracks. Her heart beat a little faster. Somehow she knew this chest held more than just trinkets. She dragged it back to the bench, settled against the damp wood, and flipped the latch. Inside lay a bundle of yellowed letters, faded newspaper clippings, and a handkerchief monogrammed EM. Eleanor's breath caught as she unfolded the topmost letter. "My dearest Eleanor, no one has ever shown me such kindness as you have. In my darkest hour, your gentle words gave me hope when I thought hope was lost. I write these words not for any return favor, but so you know how grateful I am today and always. Yours in friendship and admiration, Robert Montgomery Robert." The name sparked a rumble of memories. A man of dignity, softly spoken, who'd quietly supported Eleanor during her own time of need many years ago. They'd been friends, confidants, nothing more, and yet somehow everything more. He'd been going through a storm of his own, facing bankruptcy and disgrace, and Eleanor's kindness had saved him from despair. She never asked for anything in return. But evidently Robert had never forgotten. The second letter, then the third, all spoke of gratitude, and far more. And at the bottom of the chest, beneath the fragile correspondence, Eleanor found a thick envelope emblazoned with the seal of a law firm. Hands trembling, she broke the seal and withdrew the documents within Robert Montgomery's last will and testament. Her eyes blurred over the text as she read the critical clause. "I, Robert Montgomery, of sound mind and cordial spirit, hereby bequeath a significant portion of my estate to Mrs. Eleanor Miller, the only person who offered me genuine compassion in my time of greatest need." Eleanor's breath came in short gasps. A fortune, properties, investments, liquid assets, all designated for her. And no one had claimed it in over a decade because no one had known where to send it. As dawn's pale light filtered through the trees overhead, Eleanor's despair lifted. There, in the warmth of her own shock and awe, she saw a new path unfurling, a way not only to reclaim her dignity, but to ensure that no other elderly soul around her would be cast out into darkness unprepared. She stood up from the bench, rain still dripping from her hair, and hugged that wooden chest to her chest. For the first time since Ethan slammed the door, she felt a rush of power. True power, born not of vengeance, but of justice, kindness, and the quiet strength of a woman who had lived long enough to understand that we all owe a debt of care to those who came before us. And so Eleanor Miller, once abandoned in the night, prepared to turn the tables on a world that too often forgets its elders. But that is the story of what happened next. The morning after Eleanor discovered Robert Montgomery's will, she stepped into the sunlight as though waking from a long dream. The city around her hummed with life jays, calling in the park, neighbours, greeting one another on stoops. But she felt a new calm, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with vengeance and everything to do with justice. She began by visiting the law firm that had handled Robert's estate. At the polished reception desk, she introduced herself quietly. "I'm Eleanor Miller. I believe I've been named as a beneficiary." The woman behind the counter smiled sympathetically and passed along the will and its attendant documents. From there, the papers went to Mr. Hernandez, a senior attorney with salt-and-pepper hair and gentle eyes. Over cups of coffee in his wood-panelled office, he guided Eleanor through each clause, each fine point of inheritance law in her state. "You have full legal claim to these assets," he said, tapping the fat file. "Properties investment portfolios, a trust fund with liquid reserves. You'll need to sign these acceptance forms, and then the bank releases the funds. Title transfers for the houses will follow in 30 days, unless there's an objection." Eleanor held the papers in her hands, feeling their weight. For decades, she'd lived on modest savings and a small pension, never enough to travel, never enough to set aside for emergencies. Now she would emerge from a lifetime of caution into unexpected financial security. And she would use that security not just for herself, but for something larger. That same afternoon, Eleanor arrived at the local branch of Redwood National Bank, not as a desperate, penniless refugee, but as the rightful heir to a substantial estate. In the polished foyer, she approached the teller counter and asked for Mr. Patel, the senior credit officer. Mr. Patel was both courteous and curious, Mrs. Miller. "How can I help?" Originally, Eleanor planned only to transfer her inheritance into an accessible account. But as she thought of her son, Ethan, and daughter-in-law, Victoria, who'd callously cast her out, she realized they had long-standing debts on the family home mortgage arrears, credit card balances, even a second lien from a home equity line. The bank would now expect payments from the rightful owner. If Eleanor claimed her inheritance and assumed those debts, she would effectively seize control of the property, because any homeowner who falls behind can lose the house to foreclosure. "Mr. Patel," Eleanor said, voice steady, "before I take possession of these funds, I have another request." She slid the bank's statement, detailing Ethan's and Victoria's outstanding balances across the desk, more than $100,000 in combined liens. "I'd like to purchase these debts outright." Patel raised an eyebrow. "You want to buy your son's debt?" "Yes," she replied. "I will pay the bank the full amount owed, and in return, I would take on the mortgage and liens. It's a maneuver more common among commercial investors than among private individuals debt buying. Large financial firms buy delinquent loans for pennies on the dollar, then attempt to collect in full seizing collateral, usually real estate, if borrowers default. But nothing in the bank's policies barred a private party from making the same transaction." Patel excused himself to consult his manager and returned with a tentative agreement. If Eleanor's funds were verified, the bank would accept a lump sum payoff and then transfer the promissory notes into her name. In a hushed half-hour, Eleanor signed the necessary documents. She watched Patel enter the figures into the computer. The total owed the payment. She was making the transfer of lien rights. "Congratulations," Mrs. Miller Patel said, finally standing. "You're now the mortgagee on record for 123 Elm Street." Eleanor rose, compressing her gratitude into a nod. Thank you. Outside, she felt the late afternoon sun warm her back. The cold injustice of the previous night, the lock on the door, the rain, the humiliation too, felt as if it were in another life. Now she owned the home once denied her. Rather than gloat, Eleanor paused at the bank's front steps and considered the deeper lesson. In America, many families never question property titles until crisis strikes. No one had bothered to check the chain of ownership on her own house until she'd been forcibly expelled. Legal paperwork, deeds, liens, estate plans often gathers dust until people need it most. Eleanor resolved then and there to use her newfound resources to help other seniors navigate these very issues. But first, she had to settle her own affairs. That evening, in the cozy living room, Dorothy had lent her Eleanor drafted letters and made calls. One letter went to the county recorder's office, formally requesting the transfer of property title. Another went to her financial planner, ensuring her inheritance would be held in trust for her twilight years, shielded from unexpected expenses or unscrupulous relatives. She arranged for a certified elder law attorney to visit Dorothy's home next week, so that Dorothy could also put her affairs in order. The next day, Eleanor returned to 123 Elm Street, but this time as the rightful owner. She stepped up onto the stoop and used her key. The door swung open easily. The house smelled faintly of cleaning products and the stale undertone of hurried departure. She walked through the living room, past the photographs on the mantel, photographs of Ethan as a boy, once her pride and joy. Instead of anger, recognition warmed her chest. This was her home, and she had a chance to make it better. Eleanor paused by the staircase, running her hand along the banister. Memories of lullabies and bedtime stories filled her mind, tinged with bittersweet acceptance that the son who'd slammed that door was no longer the little boy she once comforted. She climbed the stairs to survey the bedrooms. One with floral wallpaper faded by time would become her office. The next, a spare guest room. She planned to repaint the walls in soft, neutral colours and install better lighting, practical changes that honoured comfort and dignity. That afternoon, she crafted a polite but firm letter to Ethan and Victoria. Dear Ethan and Victoria, I have assumed full responsibility for the property at 123 Elm Street. The title and mortgage are now in my name. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. If you choose to leave earlier, I wish you well on your next chapter. Sincerely, Eleanor Miller. She signed the letter in crisp blue ink, sealed it in an envelope, and dropped it at the post office. No shred of malice shaped her words, only clarity and resolve. In her years of hardship, she had learned that kindness without firmness invites further pain. Likewise, firmness without compassion hardens the heart. She struck a balance tuned to justice. In the days that followed, word spread quietly through neighborhood associations and church groups. Eleanor Miller, once homeless, had reclaimed her home by mastering the very legal details most families overlook. A local newspaper ran a human interest story, not sensational, but heartfelt, on her journey from rejection to reclamation. Social workers reached out, asking how they could connect seniors to legal resources and simple how-to guides for estate planning. Eleanor agreed to speak at a community centre next month to share her story and prevent anyone else from suffering her fate. Meanwhile, the legal machinery churned forward. Title insurance updated the public record showing Eleanor as owner. The county tax assessor's office mailed a notice of change to her. Utility companies resumed billing under her name. The bank closed Ethan's and Victoria's accounts, her final stake in a property they could no longer claim. One crisp morning, Eleanor stood on the front porch with a canvas tote bag full of muffins and hot coffee, ready to welcome Dorothy, Grace, and Lisa for a small housewarming. Neighbours peeked curiously from behind white picket fences, unsure whether to congratulate or sympathise. Dorothy arrived first, breathless with excitement. Grace and Lisa came next, bearing flowers and hugs. They toured the house room by room. In the living room, Eleanor arranged fresh flowers on the mantel. In the spare bedroom, Lisa Eleanor's teenage niece helped choose throw pillows that brought new life to the faded fabric. Downstairs, Grace and Dorothy hung a framed print reading "Home is where love lives," and they all stood back smiling at how simple items could transform a space. Finally, they gathered around the kitchen table, newly cleaned, newly painted, with steaming mugs in hand. Eleanor looked around at the faces she loved, old and young alike, and felt a swell of gratitude that warmed her like the morning sun. "I never imagined I'd see this day," she said softly. "Thank you all for reminding me that home is more than walls and a roof. It's the people who stand by you even when you think you're on your own." Dorothy reached across the table and squeezed Eleanor's hand. Grace nodded, brushing away a tear. Lisa beamed, tucking her fingers under her aunt's arm. Eleanor's inheritance had granted her security. Her own determination had reclaimed her dignity. But it was the love and solidarity of family and friends that truly made this house a home once more. And as they sipped coffee and savoured warm muffins, Eleanor knew her story had only just begun. Next would come reconciliation, with Ethan sharing of resources with others in need, and the quiet reassurance that every soul deserves to age with respect and care. The sun shone brighter that afternoon. The world outside felt softer, and Eleanor Miller, once abandoned in a storm, stood at the threshold of a new chapter. One written in mercy, courage, and the unbreakable bonds of love. Helen Roberts arrived at 123 Elm Street, just as the late spring sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn. She stepped out of her charcoal grey sedan heels, clicking on the driveway, and paused for a moment to smooth the lapels of her tailored blazer. She carried herself with quiet confidence, a seasoned investor ready to do business. Inside, Victoria Adams was pacing the living room, phone pressed to her ear. She wore a crisp white blouse and gold hoop earrings, her armor against desperation. When the doorbell rang, she hurried to open it, forcing a polite smile at the poised woman on her doorstep. "Mrs. Roberts," Victoria said, extending a manicured hand. "Please call me Helen Eleanor," replied her voice, calm and unhurried. They shook hands, and Victoria ushered her in as though inviting a guest to tea rather than a potential buyer sizing up her only asset. Eleanor spent a moment surveying the room with friendly interest. Family photos lined the mantel's smiling faces from happier times. She nodded gently. "A lovely home," she said. "I understand you're considering selling." Victoria's smile faltered. "Yes. It's been a difficult decision." She closed the door behind them and turned to face Helen. "We've had some financial setbacks. My husband's business. Well, you know how things are." Helen settled into an armchair, placing her small leather briefcase on her lap. She removed a simple notebook and pen. "I do. The market's been unpredictable." She tapped her pen. "May I ask what price you're looking for?" Victoria took a deep breath, then led Helen to the dining room table and pointed to a stack of papers. "Here's our appraisal, $750,000. She folded her arms. "That's the number my husband and I agreed on. We need at least that much to cover our debts and start fresh." Helen nodded thoughtfully, jotting a few lines in her notebook. "A fair assessment given the neighborhood, but I also factor in renovation costs and market liquidity." She paused, looking Victoria in the eye. "I could offer $700,000, assuming a quick closing and no major repairs." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "That's $50,000 less than we need." "True," Helen agreed. "But cash offers at closing eliminate bank appraisals and financing delays. I can close in 30 days tops. That certainty has value too." Victoria shifted on her feet. We could wait for another buyer. Helen smiled gently. If timing is flexible and you don't mind carrying heat costs or insurance premiums while listings languish, that's a perfectly respectable strategy. But if monthly carry costs are stretching your budget, a firm cash transaction might be the safer choice. Victoria glanced toward the front windows, as though wondering if neighbors were watching. It's just, our home has sentimental value. We'd hoped to get full market price. Helen leaned forward. Understand sentiment. My own childhood memories cling to my grandparents' old farmhouse. But sentiment seldom pays the bills. My offer reflects a balance, a respectable price, immediate liquidity, and the peace of mind that comes with a no-contingency sale. Victoria's shoulders sagged. She picked up a sheet of paper and tapped it lightly. If you could go to $730,000, no delays, cash. Only would that work. Helen paused, closing her notebook. At $730,000, I could adjust my projections, but I'd need to include a small fee for my management team. I handle properties remotely. She named the figure, $715,000. It was a strategic concession, showing flexibility while still undercutting Victoria's needs. Victoria bit her lower lip, running a hand through her hair. She glanced out the window again, then back at Helen. I'm not sure. That number leaves us $35,000 short of our debts. Helen folded her hands. I'm sorry that my offer doesn't fully meet your obligations. You do have other options. You could look at bridge financing, or perhaps find a co-investor to cover the gap. But if those avenues prove costly or uncertain, I can only work with what makes sense for me. Victoria took a shaky breath. I need to discuss this with my husband. Helen rose gracefully, offering her hand. Of course. I'll leave my card. Feel free to call me by the end of the week. As Helen walked back to her car, Victoria closed the door and leaned against it, heart pounding. She knew the sting of that lower number would loom over her finances, but she also recognized the logic of Helen's position. If only she hadn't waited so long. If only she and Ethan had planned their budget more carefully, but regret was a luxury she couldn't afford. Across the bay in San Francisco, a year earlier, a very different mystery buyer had shaken the market. A tech executive unknown in the community purchased a row of Victorian townhomes, sight unseen, paying well above asking price in cash. Rumors swirled an offshore investor, an art collector, even a hedge fund manager hiding assets. The frenzy drove up neighboring property values, leaving some sellers celebrating, and others, those who'd listed expecting ordinary offers, wondering why they'd priced themselves out. In the end, the buyer was a young couple wanting a multi-generational home, not a corporate hot money play. Their stealth approach had given them leverage in a hyper-competitive market, a lesson in how strategic anonymity and a clear, confident offer can unlock impossible deals. Back on Elm Street, Victoria's hesitation showed the importance of due diligence and the risks of waiting until desperation sets the rules. Negotiation experts often warn against two common mistakes: revealing your bottom line too early. Victoria's first move, stating $750,000, signaled her desperation. A savvy negotiator might instead express broader goals. We hope for a fair price that helps us move on quickly without disclosing the precise minimum they'd need. Failing to leverage time and certainty, Helen's willingness to close in 30 days, no contingencies, was a powerful lever. Sellers fixated on price can overlook the value of certainty when carrying costs, and emotional strain add up. A slightly lower price with a guaranteed timeline can be far more appealing. Victoria recognized both mistakes, staring back at her. She had treated the sale as a last resort, hoping for a windfall rather than crafting a proactive strategy. By focusing solely on price, she'd failed to ask Helen what she valued most: certainty, speed, minimal fuss. That evening, as Victoria sat alone in the house she no longer owned, she reviewed her notes. Helen's visit had been a masterclass in negotiation psychology, listening more than speaking, anchoring with empathy, then guiding the conversation to leverage time and risk. Victoria realized she could have prepared better researched comparable cash sales, called multiple investors, or at least staged the home to reduce perceived repair costs. She rummaged through her briefcase and found a small printout: top 5 negotiation traps. One bullet read, "Don't negotiate out of fear." She had. Another warned against allowing emotion to dictate terms. Definitely her mistake. Every mention of the house had tightened her throat. By tomorrow, she vowed to recalibrate her approach. Meanwhile, Helen Roberts drove home through quiet suburban streets, her mind already shifting to the next target: helping a family in Kansas with an inherited farm, then perhaps a rental portfolio in Oregon. Each deal followed the same principles: respect for people's sentiments, clarity about her own needs, and the calm assurance that comes from knowing every facet of the transaction. But Helen's true mission ran deeper. She understood that real estate could be more than property lines and price tags. It could shape destinies, provide stability, and restore dignity. By approaching each situation with warm intelligence, she aimed to prove that investors needn't be cold opportunists, but could act as guardians of people's legacies, stewarding homes and memories rather than simply assets. A week later, Victoria called Helen's number with a steadier voice. "Mrs. Roberts." "Helen, please, of course. Have you had time to consider my offer?" Victoria hesitated, then said, "I understand your position better now. Honestly, I'm still short of funds. Would you consider $725,000 but close in 15 days? Helen paused, imagining the spreadsheets and risk assessments flashing across her mind. She appreciated Victoria's initiative, asking for a targeted, expedited close. Yet 15 days would strain her own procedures. After a moment, she replied, "I can do $725,000 with a 15-day close, but I'll need a certified check and signed agreement by Friday morning." Victoria exhaled relief, flooding her. "I can do that." "Excellent," Helen said, extending her hand again, this time as partners rather than adversaries. "I'll have my attorney send over the paperwork." On the day of closing, Helen arrived at the title company with the certified check in hand. Victoria and Ethan sat across the table, their shoulders less stiff, their eyes tinged with both gratitude and regret. As Helen and their attorney ironed out the final signatures, Victoria met Helen's gaze and mouthed a small thank you. Outside, the sun broke through morning clouds, bathing the building in light. Helen Roberts had secured another home, but more importantly, she had demonstrated that even in the toughest negotiations, empathy and clarity could turn desperation into collaboration. And as she walked back to her car, Helen's thoughts turned to Eleanor Miller, the woman behind the investor persona, ready to embrace the next chapter. The game of wills and wallets had begun, and both sides had lessons to carry forward. And that leads us into the next part of Eleanor's journey. Victoria woke to a flurry of notifications on her phone before her eyes were even open. Overnight, an exposé had appeared on Flashpoint Daily, a local clickbait site she'd secretly tipped, casting Eleanor Miller as the scheming grandmother who duped her own son out of his home. The headline screamed, "Granny Gone Rogue: How Eleanor Miller Hijacked Her Son's House." Beneath it, a lurid caricature of Eleanor in a widow's black veil, dollar signs in her eyes, and tiny Ethan cowering at her feet. Victoria's heart flitted between triumph and panic. She'd expected some backlash, but nothing so visceral. Comments piled up. What kind of monster robs her own flesh and blood? Someone called Child Protective Services on this witch. I hope she rots in jail for fraud. On Facebook and next-door neighbours shared the link with fury. A community group she once led for holiday potlucks erupted into rumours. Mothers warned their children to beware of inheriting greedy genes. Church members whispered of divine retribution. For Victoria, seeing her mother-in-law turned into a public villain was intoxicating, until the realization hit that she'd unleashed a wildfire she couldn't fully control. By midday, her phone rang 10 times in 10 minutes. Friends she hadn't spoken to since high school asked if she needed help exposing dear old Granny. Real estate agents called, sniffing another scandalous angle. Even the building superintendent dropped off a note. "Are you okay? Heard things?" Victoria slumped on the living room couch, rereading the Flashpoint article. Every quote was fabricated. Eleanor had never spoken to any reporter. The legal expert they cited didn't exist. Yet here it was gleaming on screens in homes and coffee shops across town. Meanwhile, Eleanor Miller sat at her kitchen table with Dorothy and Grace, cups of chamomile tea growing cold beside stacks of legal documents. At first, she tried not to let the article bother her. A little gossip never hurt anyone, Dorothy said kindly. But when Grace pointed out a glaring falsehood Eleanor supposedly confessed in court to premeditated deception, her hands trembled. "They're accusing me of perjury," Eleanor whispered. Voice thick. "This isn't just talk. It's slander." Ethan, newly humbled by years of manual labor, watched his mother's cheeks color with distress. Up to now, he'd never seen Eleanor at a loss for words. "Mum, we can fight this," he said firmly. "I'll help you set the record straight." He paced the small kitchen, mind racing. "First, we contact a defamation attorney. Then we need to gather every piece of evidence, the will, the bank's debt-buying papers, the closing documents. And we issue a cease and desist." He glanced at Eleanor. "Then we go public on our own terms." Eleanor managed a grateful smile. "Thank you, Ethan. Let's do it right." That afternoon, they gathered everything they could find. Original copies of Robert Montgomery's will. The bank's receipts, showing Eleanor's payoff of Ethan's and Victoria's liens, the property title application in her name, and the signed letter she'd mailed to the couple. Dorothy photographed each document with her phone. Grace drafted a short statement. Eleanor Miller was the lawful heir and beneficiary under the last will of Robert Montgomery. I paid the outstanding mortgage and liens on my former home in full following all legal procedures. Any portrayal of these facts as fraud is false and defamatory. They forwarded the statement with scanned documents to a local attorney, Ms. Harper, who specialized in defamation cases. By the next morning, they received a terse but crucial response. A cease and desist letter would be sent to Flashpoint Daily, demanding removal of the article or face legal action. But Eleanor knew legal letters alone wouldn't quench a viral flame. "We must reclaim the narrative," she told Ethan. "We need to speak directly to people." Together, they planned a live Q&A session on Eleanor's modest YouTube channel, Eleanor's Corner, where she'd explain the truth in her own words. That evening, the Miller family set up a simple backdrop in the living room. A soft lamplight, an American flag discreetly tucked into a corner, and a small stack of the actual documents on a side table. Dorothy handled the camera and streaming software. Grace monitored the comments. Ethan sat beside his mother, ready to hand her documents as needed. Eleanor adjusted her glasses and smiled gently at the camera. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me on short notice. I understand there's a story circulating online, painting me as a greedy fraudster. I want to share what really happened." Over the next 20 minutes, she guided viewers through the timeline. Her friendship with Robert, his heartfelt letters. The will naming her sole beneficiary, The bank meeting where she bought the liens, the title transfer to her name. She held up the original will, letting the camera focus on the signature of the law firm. "This document is my proof," she said softly. "This is how I regained my home." Ethan chimed in when questions popped up in the chat. Was Mum the only heir? Yes. Robert had no other beneficiaries. Did you trick them? No. We followed every step with transparency. What about the mortgage? I paid every cent owed. The family answered calmly, clearly, and compassionately. They even invited viewers to send in their own questions via email for a follow-up session. By the end, the live stream had drawn over 5,000 viewers, far more than any Flashpoint article could muster, and the chat was filled with supportive comments. "Thank you for your honesty, Mrs. Miller. Clear, factual, and respectful, much appreciated. Happy to see the truth out there. So sorry you had to suffer this." Dorothy ended the stream with a reminder. "We'll post a link to the legal documents on our website for anyone who wants to see the originals. Please share this video to help correct the record." Grace tweeted the link. Ethan posted it on Facebook with a heartfelt note. "My mother did nothing wrong. Please watch and learn the truth." Within 24 hours, the tide began to turn. Flashpoint Daily published a short retraction at the bottom of the original page buried under ads and cat videos announcing they'd received a cease and desist. But the real shift happened on social media, where key community influencers shared Eleanor's video. The local librarian, the retirement community director, even the celebrity councilwoman who'd once visited Eleanor's book club. By the second day, a respected local news site ran a fact-checked feature headlined, "How Eleanor Miller Reclaimed Her Home and Her Reputation." They embedded clips from her live Q&A, included statements from the attorney, and even interviewed the bank's senior officer, Mr. Patel, who confirmed the legitimacy of every transaction. Victoria watched this cascade from the sidelines, her stomach lurching. The narrative she'd so carefully orchestrated collapsed under the weight of evidence and sincerity. By the time the local TV station premiered an in-depth interview with Eleanor, filmed in her newly restored living room, Victoria no longer dared to remind anyone of the old clickbait. The public had sided with truth. In the aftermath, Eleanor and Ethan met with Ms. Harper, the attorney who advised on next steps. "You have a strong defamation claim," she said. "But the best remedy is the public correction you've already achieved. If Flashpoint refuses to fully retract or remove the article, we can seek damages. But I suspect they'll comply." The family breathed easier. More than any lawsuit, it had been open communication and documented facts that saved Eleanor's name. She reflected on how easily a few malicious words had almost undone her years of effort. "We must never underestimate the power of words," she told Ethan and Dorothy, "and we must always be ready to fight for the truth." Ethan squeezed her hand. "You taught me that twice now." Word of their victory rippled outward. A nearby senior center invited Eleanor to lead a workshop on protecting yourself from elder abuse and defamation. A local attorney offered pro bono estate planning clinics. The community rallied around the Miller family, ensuring that no other elder in town would be silenced or shamed online without recourse. One crisp morning, Eleanor stood on her porch with a stack of freshly printed brochures, "Know Your Rights, a Guide for Seniors." She placed them in a basket by the door, ready to share with neighbors. As the sun rose over Elm Street, she felt the warmth of solidarity and resilience. Her journey had begun in heartbreak and betrayal, but it had unfolded into a story of empowerment: legal empowerment, media empowerment, and human empowerment. Through vulnerability and courage, she had shown that even the oldest voices deserved to be heard, respected, and defended. And so Eleanor Miller's life became a beacon, a testament that when truth, evidence, and compassion join forces, no clickbait headline can stand in the way of justice. Her story was no longer just her own. It belonged to every senior who feared being cast aside, every family fractured by greed, and every community seeking to protect its most vulnerable members. From that day forward, whenever someone asked Eleanor how she overcame the storm of slander, she would smile and say, "I spoke my truth, and my truth spoke louder." Ethan woke before dawn, the pale light of morning slipping through his apartment's thin curtains. In the weeks since his public support of his mother's legal plight, he'd found part-time work at the farmer's market, stacking crates of produce, sweeping stalls, earning just enough to cover rent and a simple breakfast. It wasn't the corner office he once imagined for himself, but each dollar felt honest, each sunrise a promise. He dressed quietly, pausing to gaze at a faded photograph pinned above his dresser. Eleanor smiling at his high school graduation. He traced her face with his thumb. That proud moment had felt like forever ago. Before ambition hardened into arrogance, before he'd slammed the door on the only mother he'd ever known. Today, however, something felt different. He'd received an unexpected message the night before. "Mum, I have a day off today. I'd like to visit if that's okay." Ethan Eleanor's reply had come swiftly. "My door is always open, son. Mum." He grabbed his coat and wallet, leaving a quick note on his bedside table. "Be back before dark." Then he walked the few blocks to his childhood home. Hands in his pockets, heart pounding. Eleanor was in the kitchen when he arrived, stirring oats on the stove and humming softly to herself. The living room felt warm and lived in colourful throw pillows arranged on the sofa. Family photos on the mantel, a small vase of wildflowers on the coffee table. She looked up and smiled when she saw him. "Good morning, Ethan." He nodded, swallowing hard. "Morning, Mum." He lingered in the doorway, uncertain. She patted the seat beside her at the kitchen table. He sat. For a moment, neither spoke. Steam curled from her mug, sunlight painted golden patches on the wood floor. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. "How's the market?" He shrugged, a rueful grin tugging at his lips. "I've learned more about life in these past weeks than I ever did in my suit and tie. There's dignity in work that feeds people. It's honest." She reached out, placing her hand over his. "I'm proud of you." His throat went tight. "Mum, I'm sorry." The words tumbled out. "I was so blind, so wrapped up in myself. I treated you like a burden. You didn't deserve that." Tears shimmered in her eyes. "I used to worry whether you'd ever forgive me for taking the house. But today, I'm just grateful you're here." He exhaled relief and regret mingling in his chest. "I want to make things right," he said, voice hushed. "Not just with you, but with the life I lost. I applied for evening classes at the community college. Business management. If I work and study, maybe I can find a better path." Eleanor's smile was a sunrise. "That's wonderful, Ethan. Education never ends, and neither does love. You have both in this house." They shared breakfast oatmeal with cinnamon and apples toast with jam, talking quietly of small things, the new neighbours down the block, the old elm tree in the park, Dorothy's upcoming visit. There was no mention of Victoria. Their focus was simply mother and son rebuilding trust. Later that morning, Grace arrived carrying a basket of freshly baked muffins. Lisa followed, laughing as she chased their elderly cat Patches through the front yard. Dorothy came last, leaning on her cane, but moving with determined grace. They settled in the living room, forming a circle around a low coffee table. Grace offered muffins all around. Dorothy passed small plates and napkins. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, dancing across the warm wood floors. Eleanor stood, placing a hand on each chair back. "Thank you all for coming," she said softly. "This isn't just a housewarming. It's a celebration of second chances. Ethan has begun rebuilding his life, and I want us all here to support him. Grace squeezed her sister's hand. He's doing great. I talked to his professor at night school, impressed with how Ethan has grounded lectures in real-world examples from the market. Lisa chimed in, eyes bright. I'll help you with homework, Uncle Ethan. Dorothy smiled, voice thick with emotion. Family lifts each other up. Tonight we feast. Tomorrow we keep moving forward. They spent the afternoon reminiscing childhood games, shared holidays, lessons learned at each other's knees. Laughter echoed in the halls where pain once lingered. Outside, the lilacs bloomed with fragrant joy, as though the garden itself joined their celebration. By evening, as plates were cleared and coffee refilled, Eleanor looked around at the glowing faces, siblings and children, old friends and new beginnings. This, she said quietly, is what home means. A week later, Eleanor stood at the front desk of the Willowbrook Senior Center, a folder in hand. Around her 20 seniors sat in folding chairs, curious eyes fixed on her warm smile. As you know, I once found myself homeless due to elder neglect. Eleanor began. But I learned that knowledge is power. Today I'll walk you through estate planning basics. Wills. Powers of attorney understanding liens and preventing financial abuse. She guided them step by step how to request a copy of a will from the county clerk. The importance of naming trusted executors, recognizing predatory lending. On the whiteboard, she drew diagrams of property transfers and joint tenancy. Occasionally, she glanced toward the back row where Ethan sat, taking notes for his business studies, offering a thumbs up when she cited him. He whispered answers to a retiree next to him, helping clarify a point about trust funds. After 2 hours, the session ended with applause. A local attorney invited to co-host offered free consultations for anyone who needed personalized advice. Seniors lined up, relieved and empowered. As Eleanor packed her materials, a woman approached with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, voice trembling. "I was afraid of becoming a burden. Now I know I can protect myself and my children." Eleanor placed a hand on her shoulder. "No one should fear their own future. We are stronger when we share knowledge and compassion." That weekend, Ethan balanced study and work, then joined his mother at a community potluck hosted by neighbors. He carried a tray of her famous lemon bars, smiling shyly as friends congratulated him on his classes. He paused by a folding table, hung with photographs from Eleanor's Legal and Community Triumphs magazine clippings, snapshots of her at the senior center, candid shots of their family celebration. He touched one photo gently, Eleanor and him arms around each other, standing in front of the house. He turned and found Eleanor standing beside him. She followed his gaze. "Hard to believe how far we've come." He nodded. "I owe you more than I could ever repay." She hugged him, then stepped back with a grin. "But you already have just by being here." Elsewhere in the city, Victoria Adams struggled with her own downfall. Released on bail after charges of attempted fraud and illegal access to corporate accounts, she found herself ostracized by old friends. Her lover had vanished, real estate opportunities evaporated, and her name now trended online as a cautionary tale. She'd tried to raise funds through crowdfunding. Exonerate Victoria Adams read the page, but no one donated. Each update was met with hostility or mockery. The law firm representing her ex-husband's company closed ranks. She realized too late that every bridge she'd burned in pursuit of a quick exit had left her utterly alone. Desperate, she reached out to a mutual acquaintance, asking for a temporary job at a local cafe. When the owner learned of her background, she was politely declined. Victoria's world had shrunk to 4 cramped walls. One evening, she called Ethan's number, an act of desperation. His voicemail played. She hung up, tears spelling out her regret. She thought of Eleanor's workshop brochures, the legal clinics, the laughter by the elm tree. She realized what she'd lost family home trust. But whether she deserved forgiveness or any chance at redemption remained a question written in the silent spaces of her own choices. Back at 123 Elm Street, autumn crept in with a chill. Eleanor and Ethan stood at the front gate, raking leaves together. The yard was quiet, save for the rustle of gold and crimson. Ethan paused, breathing in the crisp air. "Mum, I have an idea. With your blessing, I'd like to start a small business helping seniors with odd jobs. Yard work, grocery runs, minor repairs. I could combine my market experience with what I learned here. Maybe hire some classmates." Eleanor looked at him, pride shining in her eyes. "I think that's a splendid idea. It helps people stay independent longer and gives you a purpose beyond the classroom." He grinned. "It feels right." Dorothy ambled up the driveway, sipping tea from a thermos. "It's like a business with heart. Count me in as your first customer." They laughed, and the leaves danced down around them. Together they finished piling the leaves into neat mounds. The yard, once a battleground of betrayal, now glowed with warmth and unity. At sunset, the 4 generations gathered on the porch. Eleanor, Ethan, Dorothy, Grace, and Lisa sharing hot cider and pumpkin bread. The old elm cast long shadows, the sky painted in deep purples and pinks. Eleanor raised her cup. To new beginnings. They clinked mugs. Grace smiled. To forgiveness. Dorothy nodded. To family. Ethan looked at his mother. To second chances. They sipped, and in that simple moment, all wounds, past and present, felt gently mended. The path ahead would still have challenges. Victoria's shadow, Ethan's, studies aging hurdles. But they journeyed together now, heart and hand entwined. And so Eleanor Miller's home remained not just a house reclaimed, but a haven restored where dignity lived, where love endured, and where every soul, young or old, found the courage to begin again.